everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming tonight to Opportunity Green's third birthday. We thought we'd take the opportunity to have a small little panel event on a topic very close to my heart, which is the taxation of the aviation shipping sectors, or I should say the lack of taxation, and then what you do with those revenues on the other side. You may note our panel has changed a little bit. Unfortunately, there's been some illnesses and stuff, so I'm now on the panel as well, because I can take that privilege as CEO. But just quickly, really one logistical thing, which is there's going to be like filming and a few photos and stuff. It'll just be of the crowd. If anyone particularly does not want to be in that, please find any OGer. I'm definitely one. Others are in the crowd if you know them. Let us know and we'll sort that out. Otherwise, I hope you all manage to grab a drink on your way in. There will be more drinks and canapes afterwards, so just like hold tight. It is coming. And I'm sure Attracta will keep us to time and like be able to get us through. And hopefully we'll have a few questions from the audience, but we'll see. And then otherwise, just to, I guess, say a little bit about Opportunity Green, because that's kind of why we're here. So we're 3 years old now, which is completely bonkers. Both because it's been 3 years and also because it's only been 3 years. And our mission is to close the gaps in global climate action, which is probably why we've grown so much, because there's a lot of gaps. But what we do is we focus in on sectors where emissions are not yet reducing, and then we apply our theories of change. And so our first theory of change is to challenge those that are not doing enough yet. There's quite a few of them as well. But that's a wonderful legal team that we have that are bringing out all kinds of challenges all of the time. Then we find the companies that are actually doing the right thing, and we really try and put them in front of policymakers so that policymakers can be encouraged to be more ambitious, and rather than just finding the easy solution, go all the way to zero, because that's what the companies that are doing the right thing can do. And then finally, we, as a climate organization, feel we cannot be legitimate unless we also look at the climate vulnerable. Where are the climate impacts actually being? And really trying to center climate equity in what we do. And so that really centers around finance. And that is quite a topic for tonight. So with that, I will hand over to Attracta to introduce our wonderful panel and put us all through our paces.
Hello everyone, I'm Attracta Mooney. I am the FT's climate correspondent. I don't actually know that much about shipping and aviation, but I do know stuff about climate finance and have been writing quite a lot about how we pay for all of this. So I'm keen to hear what you guys have to say. And we are joined, if we start down that end, we're joined by our Arsenio Dominguez, who's the Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, Lord Deben, who is the chair of the Council for Net Zero Transport, and he was also the past chair of the UK CCC, the Climate Change Committee, the advisors to the UK government, and then Danny Sriskandarajah, the chief executive of the New Economics Foundation. So thank you very much. If we start with you, Secretary General, because we are in the middle of the IMO talks. So let's have an update, please. How are the talks going? Will we have a shipping levy? And will you get it all sorted for next spring?
Sorry, what was the last one?
Will you get it all sorted for next spring?
So things are going well, and I know that not everybody will agree with me when I say that, but I know IMO. And I know the member states, I know how dedicated they are, I know how they share the same objectives, even though the way to get to the final outcomes may have different pathways for all of them. The conversations have been long in the last week and a half so far, nearly 2 weeks. We are on track, and I'm still very confident that we're on track for the approval of the measures, not the finalization. And I want to be very clear, member states just last year made the decision after the adoption of the strategy to finalize the measures by October next year. So it is not in the spring. The spring will give you the next step, but we are due to finalize in October with entry into force in April 2027. That's the projection, that's where we're working. In relation to what you call a levy, I call it a pricing mechanism because we have several options on the table. And for me, the focus is on whether member states are going to land on the architecture of a pricing mechanism that is going to support the transition. I know that the levy is something that outside IMO, it's probably better understood by others, but the reality is that we've made a very conscious decision to look into all the economic proposals that we have on the table to find the best one that is going to assist the transition at the same time that is going to look into the different areas, particularly the small island developing states and least developed countries that will need support in order to achieve the goal of net zero by or around 2050.
Your own economic modelling, though, right, suggests that the levy is the best option, right?
Say that again?
Your own modelling, your own economic assessment suggests that the levy is the best option. Is that right?
It depends how you interpret the outcome. And this is what we were discussing this week. And of course, there's still further analysis that we will carry out. 20 different scenarios were analyzed. But again, there's still differences of view. And you will need to expect that when you have 176 member states. And again, they all have the same objective, but they have different concerns. And they are at a different level. That's a reality around the world. And that's something that the United Nations continues to tackle. So the outcome will be the appropriate solution, the appropriate measure that can take into account not just where we're going with the transition, but the concerns that have been expressed.
Okay. Aoife, do you want to come in there on whether you think a levy, because I appreciate the Secretary General's
if you call it a levy, because I know what
is likely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with anything the Secretary General has said, but I would probably add a few nuances. I mean, I agree that we are on track to get something for next year. The real question is whether it's enough and whether it will actually bring both decarbonisation of the shipping sector, which is obviously super important, but also is it equitable? And that's a really key thing when you've got 176 member states. You know, a lot of effort has been put in by the climate vulnerable around the world into the rooms in the IMO. And that has really increased these past 2 weeks. Actually, we're hearing those voices more and more, which is really, really exciting. But their proposals, which should really be front and center, are not always front and center, and they're getting a lot of pushback. So I think the thing is, if the IMO agrees something that isn't enough, we're just going to see other countries, regions add on to that. So it's going to happen. The question is whether it happens globally and together, or whether we're going to see divided countries going forward. And I would add, whilst the levy is super important, especially from the equity perspective, there's also a fuel standard on the table. And that is quite concerning as well. I mean, a fuel standard can be brilliant, but ultimately the solutions for shipping are green hydrogen fuels and their derivatives, and they're not fully available yet. So we have the risk of the countries agreeing to use LNG and biofuels in the interim, and they are not solutions. So we have to be really careful about all of those outcomes, and we will just see, if it is not ambitious enough, we will see additional legislation around the world.
Okay, Secretary General, you want to come in?
No, because it's a very interesting point, but we need to accept and acknowledge that we're going through a transition and not all the solutions will be there at the same time. And some of the decisions and some of the actions that need to be taken are actually beyond IMO. And we are working in order to promote that as well. But unless we have the energy sector, unless we have the technology, and not only in the northern hemisphere, but that also can translate and be accommodated somewhere else, we still need to accept that this is a transition. It's not going to happen overnight. There will be fuels that they will continue to be analyzed on the life cycle assessment of the fuels, but we need to take every little step possible in order to take us in the way that we have adopted the strategy on the intermediate indicative points until we can achieve the net zero by around 2050. But I take your point, it's just a realization that not everything is under our control. We are making everything possible to also encourage others to do so, and that's what I continue to call other industry and countries that can to take the necessary steps.
Lord Deben, you spent years advising governments on taking those steps that you need to take to make the transition we all have to do. But what's your opinion now? Do we have time for those kind of incremental steps? And how does that work out with this kind of equitable idea around the world?
Well, I'm pleased the IMO is doing what it's doing. Let me start off by that. But I do think there are some real questions. I mean, first of all, we talk about this as if we've got all the time in the world. I mean, we don't have all the time in the world, and we're just not going to get to net zero. I mean, it's just nonsense to say that by these small incremental steps we'll get to net zero. We're not going to do that. The second thing is I would actually disagree with the Secretary General in the sense not every country in the world has the same aim and is wanting to do the same thing. There are quite a number of companies who have no intention whatsoever of moving down this route, and one has to say that, and it's no good. Now, I agree with him that there's a real difficulty because this is the United Nations, and all these countries, whether they've got a real interest in shipping or not, all of them got part of this discussion. That's absolutely true. But I do think that they're candid friends outside, and I am a candid friend of the United Nations because I know I've worked, after all, I've spent my life trying to get the United Nations and getting people to agree together. But candid friends have to say that if we are actually seriously thinking of a not satisfactory answer, which won't come into operation until 2027, when we're trying to have net zero by 2050, then the mathematics do not add up. And it does seem to me that we have got to demand of the shipping industry very much more sharp decisions. And if they don't do it through the IMO, I'll tell you what will happen. First of all, more and more companies will not use shipping companies that don't meet the very much tougher requirements. If you're a major company which is committed to sustainability, they will say, you can do what you like, but the ships that carry our goods will have to be like that. And we, as customers, ought to be demanding of it. I expect that from Tesco's and Sainsbury's, and they will have to do it because we're going to have to press that. And when you're looking at category 3 measurements, you've actually got to take this into account. So that'll happen. And the second thing is, I think you're quite right, Eva. I don't think there's any doubt about it. It is crucial for the IMO's existence that it gets this very much more right. Because otherwise, people in Northern Europe, people in the Mediterranean, people in places which are exposed will say, bugger this, I'm not going to hang about waiting for the IMO to make a decision. I'm not having ships in my ports which don't meet these requirements. So I think the United Nations has got to recognise that it's in a very dangerous position if we're talking about tiny steps to 2027.
Danny, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, well, yes, please. So I don't want to pile on as such, but so I'm also a candid friend. I'm deeply committed to internationalism, and I suspect by almost everyone in this room will recognise that we are only going to get ourselves out of the mess that humanity has made by collaborating across borders. And then there's not an IMO point, but I think across the international system, we are seeing a sort of dereliction of duty by international policymakers on the biggest issues of our day.
Yeah.
The UN system was there to deliver development, democracy, peace. But on each of those agenda items, the international system is straining. It's not any one person's fault. It's certainly not the international bureaucrats' fault. I have a huge amount of respect for international civil servants who are trying to deal with these sorts of things. But we're victim to a sort of incomplete and potentially disastrous version of globalization. We've enabled sort of amazing movement of goods, of services, of capital, of ideas, of data, and it's made humanity much, much better off. Even in my lifetime, my life has changed fundamentally because of the sort of benefits of globalization. But anything to do with regulating those flows, which necessarily involves international cooperation or coordination or the enforcement of meaningful rules, we're falling back on. And so I think there's a sort of category of potentially catastrophic policy failures that are going to bite us if we don't get this right.
So no pressure.
No pressure.
Danny, while I'm still speaking, while you're still talking, we are, we're talking about shipping here, right? But we're even further behind on aviation. So do you want to talk us through what we're seeing there and whether an aviation tax is just a pipe dream?
Well, I don't think it is. It certainly shouldn't be. And, there are very few areas of public policy where you think, oh, that's a good idea, that works. It works because it corrects a policy failure, it addresses sort of public concerns, it delivers new resources. And aviation, the taxation of aviation surely is one of those areas where it's a sort of potentially a win-win-win, right? Because let's just step back, aviation globally is, you couldn't think of a more sort of unequally enjoyed thing. 80% of the world's population, roughly, has not set foot on a plane. But 1% of humanity is responsible for 50% of aviation-related emissions, right? So a deeply regressive distribution of who flies, which already, so as a policymaker, if you're thinking about where you might go, and if you believe in the principle of polluter pays, you think, okay, well, there's a relatively easy thing we can solve. We can create a set of levies or whatever interventions you want to sort of to change the behaviors of those who are polluting the most. You could also do that in aviation is a spectacular industry because it was ahead of the game at global data distribution. So the CRS, computer reservation systems, through which airlines share data information, has been around for 40, 50 years now. So if you wanted to track every individual on the planet in terms of how they, how often they fly, where they fly, what class they fly, it would be easy for airlines to do, right? They do it already with frequent flyer programs and the various alliances. So you've got another policy problem relatively easy to solve, which is the sort of data and the, you've got to guard against privacy issues and whatever else it is. And then coming to the point that, well, all of us have talked about in some ways is this is also a win because here's an area where you could make, it's not, you can make the taxation itself progressive and the distribution of the benefits or the proceeds of that inherently progressive as well. So, my colleague Alex Chapman here and many others at the New Economics Foundation for about a decade now have been calling for a progressive frequent flyer levy that by which, your first flight might be free of a levy, your second flight might have a 25%, your third flight and so on. So it's a sort of progressive mechanism that means that, families who work hard to have one holiday overseas a year can still do that levy free. But those of us, and I say us because I'm responsible as well, who fly a lot, will pay much more. And you take the proceeds of that and you make that, explicitly about either addressing the transition or funding the transition, or I would argue, make it about loss and damage and climate finance and filling the gaps that you all know a lot about, where rich countries have made promise after promise about delivering real finance for loss and damage. Why not take a global frequent flyer levy and put it into financing loss and damage? So here, to me, is a sort of win-win-win situation, and yet, we're still where we are.
But we don't even start with the easiest one of all, which is the huge cost of private flights.
Yeah.
And I feel very strongly that if I were if I were Prime Minister today, which would be very much better than sometimes, but I'll just say, I would merely say the extra cost of flying privately to the community in terms of climate is so much. So you will pay that, not as a tax, not even as a levy. You'll pay that because that is a proper price for flying privately. You can fly privately if you like, but you pay the full cost. And I'd take that, and to start with, I'd actually use it at home, because I think if you want to have a fair transition, and I like the word fair rather than just, if I want a fair transition, then you must show people you mean that. So I would use it to reduce the cost of powering your electric car by the public system to the same level as I pay because I'm lucky enough to have a drive. That seems to me, you immediately say to people, I really do believe in fairness. Why should you, because you don't have a drive, pay 20% instead of 5% VAT? And that you could do on that, just that mix there. And you therefore also have got people to believe that you really mean it when you talk about a fair transition, because nobody believes it. They all think that this is a phrase which politicians of all parties use. So you've got to do some of those things. And I would start with private flying because, frankly, most people think that if you look at the private flights, you see they largely fly from places to places which can be met by the national carriers. And if you want to have that extra, because you're snooty enough or think yourself important enough, then okay, but you pay every penny you damage with.
So I think I very much get where you're coming from, but when you see the headlines or when you speak to airline bosses, which aren't the private jets, right? But they're very much, they put up a good fight against an aviation tax. And the argument is always that it is ruining poor Claire from, I don't know, Leeds holiday and her one holiday a year. And the argument that it is a frequent flyer tax doesn't really get out there. So I don't know how you get past that. How do you get past that problem?
So I think there is promising news there. So, first of all, yes, an airline sector boss, like pretty much any industry leader, is going to fight their corner. So the key from my point of view is how do you influence either policymakers and or the general public to sort of change the norms around this? And I think there are policymakers we're talking to who understand that a progressive frequent flyer levy, which should poll well, should land well with the public, because it addresses exactly, as Lord Deben says, the question of fairness. It's to say, well, it's not fair that some people, 1% of people, create 50% of all carbon emissions, and shouldn't they therefore contribute to the true costs of that behaviour? So I think there's some doors opening around the sort of political palatability of something like this. We just need to get the policy design right, make sure that we have the privacy protections and the interoperability that's there, and coming back to the sort of international cooperation element, this has to have a degree of international cooperation, because just one country, it's possible that it could work, but it's going to be much more difficult. And so I'm optimistic that we are on the cusp of delivering something like that, despite the protestations of airline. And just one very briefly, but the question then becomes challenging the sort of fundamental economics of aviation, because that's where I think we need to ultimately go. Because this isn't just about paying the real price or the polluter pays principle. It's challenging the sort of orthodoxy we've backed ourselves into, thinking that somehow building ever bigger airports and attracting frequent flyers or business travelers is somehow adding real value to our economies. It's not. All the evidence suggests, especially in the last few years, post-COVID, with the ability to be able to interact with each other in relatively meaningful ways, the sort of assumptions that were made in the sort of 1960s and 70s, the models that were built about the true economic benefits of aviation, I think we need to rip them all up and start again.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Before, I want to go back to what Lord Deben said about a fair transition, right? So, and maybe Secretary General, I'll come to you for this, because I guess one of the fundamentals that you guys are going to have to discuss around some economic measure is what happens to that money, right? And whether it's going to go back into cleaning up the shipping industry or whether it is used to deal with loss and damage. What is your sense about what would work, and what is your sense from, I guess, the discussions that are going on at the moment?
Oh, we're now back to shipping. We left aviation now.
Yeah, we'll come back to shipping, but we'll extend it. We'll extend the concept of where this money might go.
On the table, we have the options of the transition within the sector, and at some point we can actually take on beyond the sector. But we need to focus on shipping first, because if we have a strategy to decarbonize by or around 2050, we need to focus in the actions that we need to take. And that includes, the discussions that we're having on the first and just transition. Now, the good thing about the panel is that we're all going to start disagreeing with each other. Because yes, geopolitics is not making our decisions easier. At IMO, we continue to demonstrate that the countries do get together, so they do share common objectives. And I am one of those who believes that the UN needs to evolve as well with time, but it continues to be the only entities that can bring parties together onto the table, discuss the differences and find solutions. And this is where we are on how we're going to use the funds. There are proposals on the table for the research and development that has to be, continue to enhance in order to get the technology, the fuels, etc. The training of the seafarers, we should never forget the people and the safety aspects that we have to look into it, because we tend to have the vision of only looking at transition into the green agenda, and we then forget the people that have to make this possible on board the ships. And at IMO, we don't do that. It doesn't hit the headlines, but it doesn't mean that we're working on it. Again, the support that we can provide to member states. There's even conversations in relation to the ports, because the ship-to-port interface. But of course, as the measure evolves and as we continue to progress with the transition, I can expect that there will be further conversations into how further we can go. I wouldn't link it to loss and damage. That's beyond the organization. That's more at the UNFCCC level, and that has been very clear. This is not utilizing shipping in that respect. Whether in the future we can continue to evolve and provide further assistance, I'm not saying no at this stage, but the focus continues to be how we can make this transition possible and provide that support and that response that is expected from us and that we've been working for many years.
So right now, you don't see an economic measure that might come out of the negotiations. You don't see that being used to help countries in, for example, the Global South deal with climate change.
We are helping the Global South because the moment that you actually start investing in shipping, that supports the economies of the countries. And we've been very clear on that. However, we also need to take into account that introducing an economic measure is not just to collect massive amounts of money, because we need to avoid a negative impact. The moment that shipping and trade starts to increase, as we're experiencing right now because of what's happening around the Red Sea, it's everybody else's around the world that is going to face that impact. And we are not here to make trade even more complicated or actually negatively impact. Some countries will be in a better position to absorb that than others. And again, it's continuing to go back to the discussions on the just and fair. And this is where we really need to listen to all those on the table and understand those concerns and how we're going to address them.
Aoife, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I would fundamentally disagree with that, I guess. So at a start, the shipping industry could reduce their emissions by almost 50% and save money tomorrow through wind, efficiency, other things like that. And the industry is not doing that. So the idea that then we're going to give them all of this money to, improve, great, but let's also make sure it's going to the right thing. Like, as I mentioned earlier, if we're going to give them this money and then they're going to spend it moving from oil to gas, for example, I would suggest that's probably not a great idea. I would also say, yes, investing in the shipping services to the Global South and making them more efficient would be great for those economies. But to take a step back, the shipping industry, while there are quite a lot of small and medium enterprises, the big shipping companies in the world are essentially European, Chinese, Korean, and they have huge profits. So if we put in this levy, presumably some of that would take those profits away. At the moment, the shipping industry is not an industry that benefits the globe. Shipping is more expensive in the Global South already, and then the profits go to the Global North. So we're starting from a fundamentally unfair position. And what we have is an opportunity to reverse that, to look at the pollution that is coming from this industry, make the polluters pay, and also then support all of the transition that needs to be done in these climate vulnerable countries that has been caused by this industry that has not paid any taxes in its history. So, and I think that's kind of what Danny was saying earlier. It's incredible to me that just because shipping and aviation are international sectors, that global policymakers have gone, oh, well, then we couldn't possibly tax them. It's bonkers. Our fundamental social contract is that you provide services, goods, whatever it is, and a little bit of that goes to pay for schools and hospitals. But we've exempted these two giant polluters, and that needs to change.
No, Deben, did you want to come in there?
Well, simply that I think in the initial stages, there's a lot to be said for using the money, which I think one should raise, for specific areas which people can therefore associate with. I think one of the problems about loss and damage, which I'm totally committed to the fact that we ought to be paying for loss and damage because we have all grown rich because of the loss and damage of other people. So I'm not arguing that at all. But the reason that I had this rather simple concept of rich people in private aeroplanes paying for less rich people who need to plug in, the reason for that is that I want people to see very clearly that there is a transfer of money from one and you don't want to open the doors for people to say, oh, well, it all goes to rich plutocrats in developing countries, or it all goes, you need to have some pretty tough things that you can say, that money made this change, which is really benefiting these poorer people in poorer countries. So all that I ask for is that there should be a circularity of this kind. I very much agree with the fact that the social contract is about all of us contributing to the services which we all use. And when those ships comes into port, and quite agree with taking the sea people very seriously and their jobs seriously, when they come into port, they're using all the facilities which are provided by taxpayers. And therefore, the idea that for some reason or other, flying and sailing, steaming or whatever, is exempt from this is obnoxious. And if people knew it, of course they don't know it, but if they knew it, they'd be very angry. And one of the things I want to do is to remove the things that people don't know are wrong before they find out and put it right, because then you are really creating a more equitable society.
I guess the one thing, though, in that argument, right, is that I can see your point, right? The private jets, you tax them, you use it to help the people who don't have the driveway, right? I'm just wondering if people, the public, and you advise governments, if the public can make that step, take that extra step, right, where you tax on something and then see that revenues go outside of their own country in speech marks. So if they pay, for example, an aviation levy, they feel like they're paying it for their own flight. Do you think that there is enough voter buy-in for that levy then to be moved to another country?
Well, I think it depends. We come back to the narrative. It's partly what the narrative is. If the tax is clearly an international tax raised from, or levy raised from everybody, then it's much easier to say that that should be done in this way. If it looks like a national tax on your own people, then there's always the pushback on that. That terrible phrase, which is entirely untrue, charity begins at home, then begins to be involved. So I want to make this clearly an international operation, but I do want at least to start with that it is absolutely clear that the international things which it pays for are discernible, clear, people can see that there is an improvement because of it. And if you take the frequent flyer tax, that's all referring to shipping in particular, but if you take the frequent flyer thing, of course, the trouble is we always want to have everything. So I'd start off by saying, you first of all tax people who have more than 3 flights a year, if you see what I mean. You get the principle into place in a way which doesn't affect the vast majority of people. So they can't use the argument that it's my holiday and I only have 1 a year, or I have to have 2 because of the children at school. We can all see that. So get rid of that by not allowing perfection to be the enemy of the good. And I'd start by saying, number 3 flight, or probably I'd start with number 4 flight, and thereafterwards. I wouldn't mind ramping it up quite sharply thereafter, but do that, and then you can win this battle. We've just got to we have to get the story right and start where people will begin with us. And then you'll begin to move.
Okay, so Lord Deben's point there about a global tax is a very interesting one, right? But beyond the IMO potentially having something, and not clear where that would go and how it would work as a pot, most of the discussions around taxes are almost on a country-by-country basis, right? And you've got Laurence Toubiana, the architect of the Paris Agreement, is currently looking into innovative sources of finance, including a whole bunch of taxes, including aviation taxes. And when you speak to her, she will say that how she sees this working is that individual countries implement these taxes. So it doesn't become a global tax, right? It becomes a country-by-country tax. And so if that is the case, what does that mean for this, like, for getting the money where it needs to be?
Yeah. Can I just say, it's very rare that I work for the New Economics Foundation, a very radical left-wing think tank, but to be agreeing with the former Conservative minister on progressive taxation, I love it. This is a happy circumstance for me. Look, let's get pragmatic here. So there's sort of at least, the wish list for me is a sort of threefold wish list. The first is, let's just get going on this class of taxes and levies, and it's not just aviation and shipping, it's wealth. The G20 in about 2 months' time, there's a Brazilian proposal about how do we finally get better at taxing excessive amounts of wealth. Capital is entirely mobile, but governments seem unable to tax capital properly or wealth properly. And so let's get started. The next desire on the sort of wish list is, let's hypothecate it and assign those revenues to be tangible. I totally agree with Lord Deben's point that if we're going to do these sorts of things, let's make sure that the benefits of those are felt by those, if we want to get political about it, who are probably most skeptical about net zero, or if we're facing a green lash, let's be intentional about how those revenues are. But then the third bit, and I come from an international development background, is if there's global coordination necessary for even getting this done, let's use at least some of the proceeds of that for addressing global challenges or fixing sort of broken global systems. Yeah. There's precedent here, the French solidarity levy, the flying levy that was created about 20 odd years ago. It hasn't raised huge amounts, but French flyers still do pay a tiny little amount that goes to a pot of money that funds global development, vaccines and other things, right? So there are examples where a solidarity levy has been used, not at huge scale, to address sort of fundamental shortcomings. And here, when we're talking about the sort of class of climate-related levies, I do think there's a very compelling, almost moral case for why we need to use at least some of the proceeds of this to address the lives and livelihoods that are being wrecked by climate breakdown. My last job was at Oxfam. We published a report a couple of years ago that showed that if you take the last 20 years of weather-related humanitarian catastrophes around the world, right? So this is just instances of where extreme weather, floods, droughts, wildfires, there's been an 8-fold increase in weather-related humanitarian disasters in the last 20 years, right? That's almost certainly to do with climate breakdown, but the international humanitarian system is broke. It's tens of billions of pounds short on actually meeting immediate humanitarian need when people are dying because of flooding. And so I think there's a compelling moral case to at least use some of the proceeds of this into funding pre-positioned resources for the international humanitarian system to respond to the inevitable rise in humanitarian need that we're going to see in years and decades to come. It's a far better system than developing countries going cap in hand after disaster strike to beg for a little bit of aid. Let's use some of these levies to create a sort of insurance pot or a pot of money that's already there to meet humanitarian need where it's at. But I recognize that that's the third step. We need to get the taxes, get them hypothecated, and ideally part of that assigned to international issues or causes.
Okay. We'll go to the audience for some questions if there are any. We've got one here. Have we got a mic? Brilliant, thank you.
Hi, thank you for such an interesting panel. I just wanted to touch on something that Lord Deben mentioned earlier, which was around the role of consumers in all of this. Because I think what Lord Deben was saying is unless the regulators get to it, it will be consumers who demand change in the decisions they make when purchasing products or services. Now, the experience I have is that sometimes it's quite tricky, at least in legal actions, to establish that consumers really place much reliance on whether a good or a service is sustainable or otherwise. And that really staunches the power of a consumer action. And so I was just wondering what your views might be on that side of things, particularly thinking about things like aviation and the availability of rail to consumers. I think one of the key problems is that rail is very expensive at the moment, and ultimately it seems to me that a consumer will often, if not in the majority of cases, choose a product that is cheaper over one that is more expensive. And so what role do existing subsidies have? What role do consumer choices have in this whole matrix of factors that might trigger behavioral change in these highly carbon-intensive industries?
Well, the older I get, the more I think that it isn't either or, but it's both and. I think this is the first part of it. So, secondly, I don't like using the word tax because I want people to understand that what we're proposing in all these areas is that the price of what you do reflects the cost of what you do. And the trouble is that we have allowed for centuries the price to reflect the immediate cost, but not the community cost. We have left cleaning up the pit heads to the community. We have constantly charged people only what it directly costs to produce things. We're beginning to understand that that isn't a proper measurement, and we should use it, therefore, not as a tax, but that we are asking for the cost. Now, as far as the customer is concerned, one of the, I think, enduring lies which are used by people to avoid doing anything is to say, well, you know, our customers don't care very much. Now, my experience in Sancroft, which I have run now for 26 years, helping major companies to become more sustainable, my experience is that that's almost always untrue. It is not true of the majority, but it is true of sufficient numbers of people to make it matter. And I'll give you two simple examples. You can't think of a company which is applying its products to a wider range of very ordinary people, and Primark. Primark now is absolutely, first of all, insistent on making sure that everybody who works and makes anything is properly paid. It has a proper system. We've done all that for them. But more importantly, in this context, is they tell people about it. And what they've found is that the very people whom we were always told didn't care about it, do care about it. And another example of that is that if you look at the railway versus air thing, I'm finding many more people now taking the railway because they have begun to care. Now, if you begin then to get the pricing right, then you begin to make it possible for people to make that decision and take the lead by being able to say, and what's more, it's cheaper that way. And we come back to this issue of price. I always think that the problem with those who don't like capitalism is because they don't take capitalists on their own game. And I want to take, because I am a capitalist, I want to be taken on their own game. And that is, you make people pay the proper price for everything. Once you start doing that, then you can say, and what's more, we're going to help those people who can't pay that price in a direct way. So you begin to make the system work. Whereas what has happened is that capitalism has been captured by the people who are in place. This is what has happened throughout the world. So it's Peabody coal that is what people listen to, which is why I like very much the concept that you are going to get progressive companies to talk to governments. Governments are usually shouted at by unprogressive companies, and what you want to do will make a big difference.
Thank you. I hope so. And it is what we're finding as well is the progressive governments or the progressive companies quite often just assume that because they're doing the right thing, as many environmental NGOs, and I'm definitely guilty of this, because we have the right and the truth on the science on our side. Obviously, as soon as people understand that, they'll just do it. But I mean, on the consumer thing, just like one thing that always, is incredible on the aviation side is because you have all of these national airlines, they can just call up the Prime Minister or whoever it is and get whatever it is killed. Meanwhile, NGOs are starved for cash to actually work on aviation. So just a plug to any funders in the room.
I'd second that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Oh, we've got one here as well, please.
Thank you very much. A very intriguing panel. My name is Dominik Englert. I'm a senior economist at the World Bank, and I usually work on shipping. So I'm more familiar with shipping than with aviation, but I do care about decarbonizing aviation. And at the IMO this week, we've spoken a lot about food security. Some parties mix up food security with food competitiveness, but that's a completely different question. But that is an argument that I totally get. There is a right, in the context of a right to a decent life, there's a right to food. There may be also, you are entitled to food, maybe you're entitled to shelter, maybe you are entitled to healthcare. And that needs to be affordable. In the case, and that is important in shipping because shipping provides this. In the case of aviation, what I don't understand is where this idea comes from that aviation needs to be affordable. There are so many products and services, take massages, take lobsters, take champagne and so on, where everybody accepts is, okay, these are luxury goods and not everybody can afford them. Maybe only the rich can afford them as long as they pay the right price for it. But where does this idea come from that aviation needs to be affordable to everybody? And I also accept the right to minimum vacation of whatever. I know that we differ here with the European standards and the US-American standards, for instance, what the minimum days should be. But you're entitled to a vacation, but are you entitled to vacation in a remote area 5,000 kilometers away where you need to fly to? Where does this cultural idea come from that we try to defend?
Ryanair, sadly.
Except for, to be fair, we'll defend the national airline and or the not national airline, but Ryanair don't actually do very long haul flights. They aren't.
No, but they brought in the price revolution that makes us assume we should be able to fly to Berlin for the weekend for €20 return, which is bonkers.
On that then, Danny, like, where does it come from? And I guess, how do you change that mindset?
Yeah, so I think, for me, it's about seeing it in the whole, right? So you've put your finger on one really important issue, which is that aviation has become aspirational, right? And you can understand why. We are a species that loves exploring. We're only as successful as we are because we love, we have wanderlust built into our DNA. And so, in some ways we've got that, but then it's this, the economics of it that I was talking about earlier, that we've also been sold this idea that, it's a fantastic opportunity to be able to fly, but hey, by the way, it's amazing for the economy, for all those communities that are around airports that are supposed to get these massive benefits, apparently, from airport expansion, because that's what the models say. Yeah. And then this opportunity cost or the alternative, which is, I think, from the earlier question, which is that we've come to think that this has to be the most efficient way. So it's the most luxurious way, the most economically beneficial way. And Louise Haigh, who's the British Transport Secretary, is obsessed with Wi-Fi on trains. And I admire Louise's obsession with Wi-Fi on trains because I think she's instinctively onto something, right? Which is, we think, we have to get a plane because it'll get us there quicker. The alternative is to take the train where the Wi-Fi doesn't work. I can't be as productive. And it comes back to even in the last 4 or 5 years, some of the sort of the pros and cons of different ways of traveling have changed and will continue to change. And so I think if you see it as a whole package, and this is why I would underline your call for more resources from the sort of the good side of this debate, right? I don't know if any of you were at the Labour Party conference, but did you see the Heathrow Lounge?
Yeah.
Did you see the Heathrow Lounge inside the Labour Party conference? One of the glitziest, loveliest things that new MPs, hundreds of new Labour MPs are being given their welcome pack from Heathrow to say, welcome to parliamentary life. What did you do at party conference?
Well, we got some banners actually. Our stand was, yeah.
We did a
didn't
round
win best
table.
stand, but yeah.
So there isn't even a sort of level playing field here around changing the norms of some of this.
But don't you think one of the problems is that you have to accept that when things have been, to say that you can't do it is different from when things haven't been. I mean, I come from a part of the country where running water came pretty late in Suffolk. My predecessor, much of his time in Parliament was increasing the running water to villages. Now, nobody today would say in Britain that you shouldn't have running water, but they did argue that in 1947. They genuinely did. It wasn't necessary. You could do without it. I just think we have to live in the world that we live in. And we live in this world in which people have learnt to fly. And they want to have holidays, and they're used to that. So how do we make that a more acceptable, to start with, a more acceptable part without getting the kind of reaction which we are bound to have if you take away something that people have had? I do think that we should make long distance flying very much less attractive than we have it at the moment, because it is a very expensive part. But don't kid yourself how difficult this sort of thing is. Let me tell you what the first thing that would happen if we did what I want to do, which is to follow your route about taxi. The first thing is every politician in the north of Ireland will say, this is excluding us from the United Kingdom. That's what that is. This is entirely unacceptable. Only they say, this is entirely unacceptable. And that's what they'd say. And they'd get real, this would become a real division between the sides. It would be a Republican versus Unionist operation. So let's not kid ourselves about how difficult these things are, and how what you do is to try to get it right in the beginning by going for the things that people can't use other excuses for. Like the ludicrous excuse at the moment, every time you want to have a solar farm, they say, oh, we're very short of land for growing crops. It's total nonsense. We're not doing something which you can't use by putting sheep on it, for example. And you're not doing something that anybody who says that really cares about. What they're doing is to find an excuse for opposing something they don't like. And that is what we'll have if we don't start off by being very careful as to where you start the programme and then how you move it onwards. And you have to be very careful about things that people have and taking it away from them. It's not unreasonable to say, if you have it 3 times a year, you have to pay for the 4th.
Okay, I think we're going to run out of time, so very quickly, I'm sorry, so it's, okay. Very quickly, will we see some sort of levies in some of these sectors, an innovative source of finance? When will we see it, and how long will it take for that money to get sent to the global south, or in a more equitable basis, as we might suggest? So you need to give me very quick answers. I'm going to start with you, Danny.
Yes, in the next couple of years here or in continental Europe, a bit longer for that money to be sent to the global south.
I agree, it'll be very quick. I mean, in shipping, we've got our deadline of next year, so we'll see that, and it'll start in 2027. And on aviation, maybe 2 in the weeds, but the emissions trading system for international aviation will come back in 2027, and some of that money will go to climate vulnerables. So 2027 is the year, actually. There we go. Okay.
Yes, I think that's true. I think we also have to have a very major education of the Treasury to understand that hypothecation is not the sin of sins. They really do hate hypothecation because it means they don't control where the money goes. And I'm the minister who produced the first hypothecated tax in British history, really, which was the landfill tax. And I remember producing the landfill tax, explaining it, with Ken Clarke as Chancellor, and a very nice man who was a Mandarin said, very good idea, Secretary of State, but I'm afraid, of course, it can't be done because it means hypothecation. And Ken Clarke said, well, that's a pity because we're going to do it. And the man almost collapsed in front of him. So you really do have to get the Treasury to understand that hypothecation is actually a good thing because people actually then realise that they're paying tax for something they actually want.
Okay, and Secretary General?
I think I already answered that question.
Okay.
And you know, I'm a believer of IMO. You will expect me to say that. Member states, we all made a commitment. We stand by our commitment. We have our timelines, and we're meeting the timelines.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. And Aoife, you wanted to say a few more words, did you?
Yeah, I basically just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. I especially obviously want to thank our funders. They're always dear to my heart, so thank you, our funders. And yeah, just thank you to our brilliant panel. Thank you so much for taking the time. I very much enjoyed it, and thank you so much, Attracta, for putting us through our paces. Yeah, really hope everyone enjoyed it and got something out of it. There will be drinks and canapes. Enjoy yourselves.